Hello, students. I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Chapter 3, which covers factors influencing the research process. In this video lecture, we will cover the steps in the social work research process, which include the following: identifying a problem and posing a research question, problem formulation, choosing a research design and data collection methods, implementing the research design and data collection methods, processing and analyzing data, and finally, writing up our results. In terms of learning objectives, by the end of this video lecture, you should be able to identify and explain the steps in the social work research process, and identify and explain the 6 key factors that influence the social work research process. So we are still in Unit 1. We've already covered chapters 1 and 2, and now we will cover chapter 3. We will conclude this unit by discussing chapter 4, which covers quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods of inquiry. So as we discuss the social work research process, we will also discuss some of the key factors that influence how this process unfolds. Some of the key factors discussed in your text include theory, ideologies and paradigms, logic, or whether we approach our research from a deductive or inductive standpoint, social work practice models, feasibility and applicability of our research to practice, and finally, the current literature on our topic. Here are the phases in the social work research process. We will walk through each of these over the course of this video. Before we get into the details of each phase, I wanted to give you a sense of when you can expect to hear more about each of these topics. We've just covered the evidence-based practice process, and now we are starting to move more toward the scientific method or the social work research process. And so the purpose of this lecture video is to kind of foreshadow some of the topics that you can expect to hear more about in the future. So I just wanted to give you a sense in the table on the right of exactly when we will discuss each of these phases again. So for step 1, we'll discuss more about this step in chapter 7. In step 2, we will discuss more about this step in chapters 7, 8, and 9. For step 3, we'll discuss more about this in chapters 11 through 16. And finally, step 7, we will discuss more about this in module 13. So as you can see, we won't cover every single step, but we will cover the most important and key ones. And so I always like to give students a sense of what they can expect from the course. And so because this course is not a statistics or data analysis course, we won't get too much or go into too much detail on the analysis of quantitative and qualitative data, but we will touch on this topic. So this is where we're headed. So we're just going through a brief overview to kind of start to understand and wrap our minds around the social work research process. And the table on the right gives you a sense of where we're headed and where we're going. So I hope that this has been helpful. So again, we're going to discuss or look at an overview of the social work research process. And we're going to do this by using specific examples from my own research on non-resident African-American fathers. I figured that this will be a helpful way to give you a sense of what the social work research process looks like in a real world context. And as we talk through an example from my own work, I will also point out and discuss some of the factors that influenced how this work unfolded. So of course, we'll start by discussing step 1, which involves identifying a problem and posing a research question. So we are at the very top of our diagram here. So step 1 specifically involves identifying the research problem and posing an initial research question. And I really wanted to emphasize the word initial because there's always the potential for the research question to change throughout the process. In fact, it often does change. And I will provide you with an example of how mine changed as well. So we have to keep in mind that The research questions that we often pose early on are just preliminary questions that we can expect to change, but we have to start somewhere because our research question is our anchor and it's our guide throughout the research process. But at the same time, we have to remain flexible throughout the process, understanding that things can change, including our research question. So in terms of identifying the research process, one of the things that I had to do was do a great deal of reading on the background related to my topic. Just general information related to fathers and children, and just to give me a general sense of what the major arguments are in the literature. And so what I found is that there were two primary conversations or arguments going on at this time. And I really emphasize at this time because the arguments can be very different now. But at the time that I did this work, there were these two arguments going on that on one side said that there was a great deal of focus on the negative effects of father absence given the rising rates of single parent homes. And on the other side, the argument was that physical absence from the home is, although it is often equated with a lack of father involvement, it doesn't necessarily preclude a father's involvement with his children. So in other words, just because a father is not in the home with his child on a full-time basis doesn't necessarily mean that he isn't involved. And this is particularly true for non-resident fathers and within African-American families as well, simply because family structure within non-resident father families as well as African-American families tends to be very fluid. And there are a lot of assumptions that are often made about non-resident fathers in terms of them being not uncaring or not involved. There are many assumptions that are made, but it's oftentimes because we don't have a very good understanding of this kind of family structure within society. Despite the changes that we've seen to family structure over time, the nuclear family structure is still the predominant structure within the US. And so there are a lot of assumptions that are made and many things that are not well understood when it comes to this particular group of fathers. And so as I continue to read about my topic and continue to try to nail down exactly what the problem was, there was one key study that I ran across that looked at instability and levels of involvement over time. And one of the main things that they found in this study is that the predominant pattern of involvement among non-resident African-American fathers at this time was described as marginal and increasingly fragile over time. And so if you look at the diagram to the right, the two categories that non-resident African-American fathers fell within primarily was either low increasing or high decreasing. In other words, African-American fathers, non-resident African-American fathers either started out with very low levels of involvement with children at birth and increased over time, or started with very high levels of involvement at birth and decreased over time. But either way, there was this instability in involvement. And the reasons for this instability were not always clear. And so at this time, many researchers were calling for more studies that delineated or helped us to better understand those factors that predict or influence or explain this instability or these patterns of these unstable patterns of father involvement. And so these studies really influenced the way that I thought about my problem. And so it led me to posing this initial research question, which was, what are the factors that influence patterns of involvement with children among non-resident African-American fathers? And so now we're moving into step 2, which again is problem formulation. And so we're now here in our diagram. And so as you can see, this particular step is composed of a few other steps. So step 2A, which involves sharpening the research question. So this is where we become even that much more precise about exactly what it is that we want to know. And so a few factors that influence sharpening our research question includes the current literature on the topic, theory, ideologies and paradigms, practice models, and feasibility and applicability of our question to practice. And so step 2B involves specifying the purpose of our study. So we have to get very clear on what the exact purpose of our study is. And then also step 2C, which involves conceptually and operationally defining study variables. And so not only do we have to specify the purpose of our study, but we also have to define each of the concepts in our study and really become clear on exactly what it is that we're trying to measure within our study. So we'll talk about these steps, and we'll break each of these sort of sub-steps down momentarily. So step 2A, so let's talk a little bit about sharpening the research question and what this looked like in my work. So as I mentioned, formulating a problem, part of doing this is sharpening and refining that initial research question. So we're becoming that much more specific about the question that we're asking. And as I just mentioned, there are several factors that can influence the sharpening process. And so here are some of the key factors that influenced how I went about sharpening my research question. So it was the current literature on the problem, it was the existing theory, as well as the applicability of my research question to social work practice. And so, as I mentioned previously, there were a few key studies related to instability and levels of involvement that really influenced my thinking about my problem. And so, the studies that are here in red at the bottom of the screen are the key studies that really influenced my thinking and, in turn, influenced how I went about refining my question. In addition, in my review of the literature on my topic, I also ran across several key theories related to my topic. And so that's one of the things that you'll run across as you're doing a literature review on a topic and you're trying to understand a problem. You also oftentimes run across literature related to theories that can be used to better understand the problem as well. And so one of the key theories in the literature at the time was called Belsky's, and it was really more like a model, a theoretical model rather. And so it's called Belsky's process model of the determinants of parenting. And so essentially what this particular theoretical model suggests is that parenting, the outcome of parenting or one's parenting, is influenced by the characteristics of the parent, the characteristics of the child, and also contextual sources of stress and support, or the larger context in which parenting occurs. And so some of the contextual sources of stress and support include things like the marital relationship, the work environment. So the underlying assumption of this theoretical model is that these sources that are present in the larger context, these sources can be a source of stress or they can be a source of support. So the marital relationship, it can be a source of stress or it can be a source of support. One's work environment can be a source of stress or it can be a source of support. And so overall, these three categories are all factors that can have a bearing on one's parenting. And so I drew upon this particular theoretical framework in order to frame my own study. And so, but I tweaked it a little bit, as you can see. So instead of looking at the parents' characteristics in general, I changed that to say the father's characteristics. So there were specific characteristics within the father that I wanted to further investigate. And I also looked at, well, let me back up and say the father characteristics that I chose to focus on specifically was the father's developmental history, or specifically his relationship with his own father, as well as his sense of efficacy when it came to parenting. In other words, a father's level of confidence in his ability to be a good father to his children. So I looked at those two father characteristics. I also looked at the child's age and the child's sex or gender. And then finally, as it relates to the broader context, I looked at the co-parental alliance. So the extent to which the father felt that he had a cooperative relationship with his child's mother. And I also looked at the status of the relationship between the parents. So did they report being married? Did they report being divorced? Did they report being just friends or having no relationship of any kind at all? What was the status of the relationship between the parents? So these were sort of the larger contextual factors that I looked at, because we know that father involvement happens within the larger context of the co-parenting relationship. And so these are the factors that I examined, or the predictors that I examined in my study. And so as you can see on the previous slide that I shared, this theoretical model that I employed in my study was largely influenced by Belsky's process model of the determinants of parenting. And so based on the current literature, as well as the theoretical framework that I just shared, my final research question ended up being, what set of father characteristics, child characteristics, and contextual sources of stress and support best predict father involvement among non-resident African-American fathers? So as you can see, the literature as well as the theoretical model that I selected had a large influence on the final research question that I ended up posing in my work. And so in terms of implications of this work for social work practice, as I thought through my question, I also had to think through how investigating this question might be useful for social work practice. So we call this the so what. So when we think about our research, it's like, okay, so what? What will this all mean for social work practice? And so two of the major implications for this work is that positive father involvement is associated with optimal levels of child and adolescent developmental outcomes. And I really emphasize the word positive because it's not just about father involvement. It's specifically when fathers involve themselves in a positive way in the lives of their children that can lead to optimal child and adolescent developmental outcomes. So because we know that positive involvement can lead to positive outcomes for children, we need to understand, in order to promote these positive outcomes for children, it's important for us as social work professionals to understand those factors that predict a father's involvement with children. So ideally, we really want fathers to be involved, but we need to better understand the reasons why some might be involved to a greater degree or higher level than others. So this is another factor that had a bearing on my question, is how applicable is my question to social work practice? And so I had to think through that as well and think about why going down this road and posing this specific question would matter for social work practice. I also want to say a little bit about the utility of theory for social work research. So using theory in our studies, although some studies can be atheoretical, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not useful. So in other words, atheoretical means that some studies don't include a theoretical framework. It's not necessarily required. And it doesn't necessarily mean that because a study doesn't apply a theoretical framework that it's not useful. It can still generate very useful findings that can be applied to practice. But the benefit of using theory is that it helps us to make sense of, see patterns, and explain the findings from our data. It also allows us to predict human behavior in theoretical terms, so that if we understand the theory itself, it makes it easier for us to predict human behavior based on the tenets of the theory. Theory also helps us to develop useful interventions, as well as implications for practice and policy. So these are some of the reasons why utilizing or employing a theory in our research can be useful, but it's not necessarily required. So now let's talk about step 2B, which involves specifying the purpose of the study. So there are 4 purposes of research that are mentioned in your text, and they include exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, and evaluation. So exploratory research is a preliminary investigation of a relatively unknown field, aims to gain new insights on a topic. So typically when we refer to our research as exploratory, this is when we're exploring a brand new topic on something where it's very little research has already been done in this particular area. And so typically with exploratory research, there are no hypotheses that are specified in this kind of research simply because there's no precedent upon which to base a hypothesis. If there's very little work that's been done in the area, then we really don't have much of a precedent. Okay, so typically there is no hypothesis specified in exploratory research. Explanatory research helps to explain the why behind phenomena. So it helps to explain why phenomena occur, and it helps to predict future occurrences. This type of research is typically characterized by research hypotheses. So typically in explanatory research, you'll see research hypotheses that specify the nature and direction of the relationship between the variables being studied. So within explanatory research, you'll typically see things like the words like correlates or predictors or antecedents, or this is the type of language that you usually see in explanatory research, because the goal is usually to look at what factors or what correlates or what antecedents predict a particular outcome. Okay, so we're usually trying to explain why something is occurring in explanatory research. In descriptive research, the purpose of this kind of research is to describe the characteristics of the population or phenomena being studied. So oftentimes we will employ or approach our research in a descriptive manner when we're just trying to describe a problem. We're not trying to look at the relationship between variables at all. We're just trying to describe a phenomena. And this often happens when the particular body of research is very new, and we don't know much about how variables are related, but we're simply just trying to describe a phenomena. This type of methodology focuses more on the what of the research subject rather than the why. So we know that in explanatory research, we're trying to explain why something has happened. In descriptive research, we're trying to explain what has happened, right? So if we take the example of child abuse, for example, in Waco, rates of child abuse in Waco, we might look at how prevalent child abuse is in the city of Waco. That's more of a descriptive kind of study, because we're simply just trying to look at how prevalent is child abuse in the city of Waco. Okay, so that would be more of a descriptive kind of study. But if we wanted to look at and explain why child abuse is occurring in the city of Waco, that would be more explanatory, because we're trying to describe why. Perhaps we might ask the question, what are some of the factors that predict child abuse in the city of Waco, right? So if we're looking at factors that predict, we're trying to explain why. What are some of the reasons this is happening, okay? So if we're trying to explain why, that's explanatory, okay? If we're trying to explain what, if we're just trying to give a broad view of the prevalence rates. So when we're looking at descriptive research, one of the key words is prevalence. Okay, so we're looking at the prevalence or the scope of a particular problem. How big of a problem is this? How prevalent of a problem is it? That's more along the lines of descriptive research. In terms of program evaluation involves collecting and analyzing information about a program's activities, characteristics, and outcomes in order to systematically assess its worth, time, money, effort, and resources spent to achieve goals. So we're going to get into program evaluation research. There's a whole chapter on program evaluation in your text, but just generally speaking, the goal of program evaluation is, and the reason why we evaluate programs is because oftentimes there are government dollars or public dollars that are being put into certain programs, and we need to be able to evaluate those programs in order to determine the extent to which they are achieving their intended outcomes. Because if they are achieving their intended outcomes, then great, that's a good use of time, money, effort, and resources. But if they are not achieving their intended outcomes, then maybe that's not the best use of resources. And so that's really the primary goal of program evaluation research, is to really determine whether what we're doing is really working. And there are many different ways that we can go about evaluating a program. We can use quantitative methods, qualitative methods, mixed methods. So we can use a variety of methods in order to engage in program evaluation research, with the goal at the end of the day being to determine whether whatever the program is doing is actually working for the purposes of preserving societal resources. So the purpose of my study, so we just talked about the 4 different key purposes of research studies. So the purpose of my study was explanatory. So remember that I said I set out to examine several different predictors of involvement, specifically among non-resident African-American fathers. And so specifically, the purpose was to predict which set of factors best predict father involvement among non-resident African-American fathers. So remember, I said that word predict is key in explanatory research, because ultimately what we're trying to do is to explain why, right? So why is it that some fathers are more involved in the lives of their children than others? So what are the factors that predict these varying levels of involvement? Okay, so the purpose of my study, again, was explanatory. Now let's talk about step 2C, which involves conceptually and operationally defining study variables. So we're going to get more into this later on in the semester, but conceptual versus operational definition. So a conceptual definition, or when we conceptually define variables, this is a process of specifying what we mean when we use particular terms, or what is the agreed upon meaning for all of the concepts in our study. So we have to come up with some definition, not ourselves, rather not us coming up with, but we have to find a definition within the literature that helps us to specify what we mean when we use a particular term. So we're not coming up with the definitions, we're finding those definitions within the literature. But either way, we have to be very clear and precise about what we mean when we, for every single term or every single concept that we include in our study. In terms of operational definitions, this involves specifying how the concepts that we include in our study will be measured so that they can be empirically observed in the real world. And this is particularly true for quantitative studies, is that we have to have a way to measure every single concept or variable in our study. If we can't measure it, we can't study it. And this is only true for quantitative research, right? Qualitative research is a whole nother animal. But in quantitative research, we have to have a way of measuring every variable in our study in order for us to be able to observe it in the real world. And so, in other words, I had to come up with both a conceptual and operational definition for all 6 of my predictor variables. So as you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, for each of these variables, I had to come up with both an operational and a conceptual definition. So here are all of my conceptual definitions. So as you can see, and actually there were 7, let me go back to this slide, there were 7 variables. So we have the 6 here on the left and also the criterion variable in the green box, which is father involvement. So we can't leave that one out. So as you can see here, there are 7 definitions, 1 for every variable. So for father involvement, developmental history, parenting self-efficacy, child sex, child age, parental relationship status, and co-parental relationship status. And notice that I pulled these definitions from the literature. So you see the citations for each of the variables that are included, okay? So these are my conceptual definitions. In addition, I had to come up with or find within the literature measurement tools or operational definitions. So we call our measurement tools our operational definitions. So how am I going to operationalize each concept? So Each of the concepts were operationalized through survey instruments. Okay, so for the concept of father involvement, I use the inventory of father involvement, and you can see the citation here for that particular measurement tool. For developmental history, I use the father presence questionnaire. For parenting self-efficacy, I use the parenting sense of competence scale. For child age, child sex, and parental relationship status, I use a demographic questionnaire. And for co-parental alliance, I use the parenting alliance inventory. Okay, so for every single variable included in the study, I had to come up with not only just a way to define them, but also a way to operationalize them as well. And as I mentioned, we'll talk more about conceptualization and operationalization coming up here soon in the next few chapters. Now let's talk about step 3, which involves choosing a research design and data collection methods. So we are now here in our diagram. So here are some of the key decisions that I had to make in terms of choosing a research design. So the first decision was, will I go with a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods design? Will I use what will my sampling plan be? So how will I go about locating or sampling the participants in my study? Will I use a random sample or a non-random sample? And we'll talk more about sampling methods later on in the semester, but this is definitely a decision that we have to make over the course of the research process, particularly when we get to this step. And then what will my data sources be? How will I go about collecting data? Will I use interviews? Will I use self-report surveys, direct behavioral observations, or available records? How will I go about collecting this data? So these are some of the decisions that I had to make in the process as I thought about research design. And so ultimately, the way in which my research project was designed is that I chose a quantitative method, which meant that I primarily relied on survey tools. And as I just shared with you, I shared all of the survey measures that I used. And so I went with a quantitative design. And then also in terms of sampling methods, I use convenience sampling and snowball sampling. And as I mentioned, we'll talk more about sampling methods later on in the semester, but just so that you know, these are the 2 sampling methods that I employed. My primary data source for my research was non-resident African-American fathers from 8 fatherhood programs in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. So at this particular time when I conducted this work, I was living in the Washington, DC area. And so that's where my data came from, is from these fatherhood programs in the city of Washington, DC. And I also ventured out into the state of Maryland and Virginia as well in order to collect this data. In terms of the data collection method, I used self-report, self-administered surveys. And so fathers were reporting on behalf of themselves. Some of the surveys were self-administered, meaning that they read through and completed the surveys themselves. But if there was ever a challenge in terms of literacy or reading, I administered the surveys or I assisted the participants in taking the surveys. So that would be referred to as more of like an oral administration of the survey. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the research onion, this concept of the research onion. Because oftentimes we don't realize some of the beliefs and assumptions that are underlying research studies. And so this is a diagram that kind of describes research as an onion. It has multiple layers that we often don't realize. When we just pick up any given research study, we don't think about what's the underlying philosophical assumption of that study? What's the research approach, right? What's the research strategy or the time horizon or the data collection methods? But every research study has an underlying research philosophy, whether it's positivism, realism, or interpretivism. All studies come from a particular research approach, whether it's deductive or inductive. All studies use a particular research strategy, whether it's an experiment, survey, case study, whether it's grounded theory, ethnography, or action research. All research studies also have a time horizon. So whether the research is done cross-sectionally or longitudinally. right? So cross-sectional research is research that is done at one point in time. So we kind of refer to this as a snapshot. It's just done at one point in time and that's done, and it's done and over with. Whereas in longitudinal research, this type of research is done over a period of time, over an extensive period of time usually. Multiple waves of data are collected usually in longitudinal research. And then finally, all studies have some type of data collection method. So if we think about research, we think about it, one of the easiest ways to think about it as an onion. And so I want to talk a little bit about peeling back the layers, the various different layers of my study. Okay, so although I didn't say this, right, there are many layers to it and some assumptions that underlie the way in which I approach my study. And so the primary research philosophy or paradigm that underlies my study is positivism. The research approach that I took in my study is a deductive approach. The research strategy or methodology that I employed is survey research. The time horizon was cross-sectional. And finally, the data collection method that I employed was a questionnaire. And I'll allow you to read through the description of each of these in your own time, but I just think it's important that you understand that no matter what study you read, that there are many different assumptions that underlie it. And so if we think about it, as I said, as an onion, we can kind of break down the various studies that we may come across to really kind of understand all of the various different thought processes and assumptions and ideologies that underlie them. And so here's a diagram that just kind of helps you to understand the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. And I'll allow you to look over this in your own time as well. But typically when it comes to deductive reasoning, we're typically starting with some kind of theory, even though some studies, as I mentioned previously, are atheoretical, so we don't necessarily have to start with a theory. But sometimes we might start with a theory that determines how we shape our hypotheses and our research questions. We pose our questions and our hypotheses, then we go out and we observe and we collect our data, we make our observations, and then we determine whether we have found support for our original hypotheses or not. So can we confirm our hypotheses or do we need to reject our hypotheses? So this is typically the process of deductive logic or reasoning. By contrast, or on the other hand, when it comes to inductive reasoning, we typically make our observations. We look for patterns in those observations, and then we come up with a tentative hypothesis, and then we pose a particular theory. So we're starting from the bottom up in this sense, that we're allowing the data to inform us. So we make our observations, and we allow the data to inform our thinking about any hypotheses that we might pose. So the data determines our hypotheses in this case. And then we come up with a theory in terms of the patterns that we found in the data. And so typically a deductive approach is associated with quantitative research, and an inductive approach is associated with qualitative research. And so overall, my point here is really to say that the beliefs and assumptions that we hold, or the beliefs and assumptions that underlie our research, influence our research philosophies, and these things also influence our research design. So as I mentioned before, all researchers come to their work with a set of beliefs, assumptions, and philosophies that ultimately influence how they design their research studies. Now let's talk about step 4, which is implementation of our research design and the collection of our data. And so we are now here at this step in the social work research process. I won't say too much about this. The one thing that I'll say is that I collected data, as I mentioned, from several different fatherhood programs. And as I reflect on this project, oftentimes research can be a very messy process, and things can turn out in very unexpected ways. And so we always have to be prepared, and we always have to do as much reading on our population as possible before we go out into the field. One of the things that I was prepared for when I went out into the field was the fact that many of these fathers, non-resident fathers in particular, some of them are low income, and the issue of literacy was brought up in many of the studies that I reviewed. And that's not to say that the entire non-resident father population is low income. There's so much variation among this group. Non-resident fathers can be divorced fathers, they can be military fathers, they can be fathers that are of a lower socioeconomic status, fathers that are of a higher socioeconomic status, fathers that are within various different racial ethnic groups. There's so much variation within non-resident fathers as a group. However, one of the things that did surface quite a bit was to be prepared for any literacy issues as it relates to the administration of surveys, and just kind of a heads up in terms of, that researchers should be prepared to orally administer surveys if necessary to this particular population. And so that was one thing that I was prepared for. I was also prepared for how difficult it might be to actually get participants. And so I started out with 2 sites for data collection, and I ended up with 8. And that was unexpected. And it's just, a part of studying this population. There are unique things about every population that we as researchers study. And so you have to be aware of these things before you go out into the field. And so one of the things that I would say is, as it relates to data collection, is to really do as much reading as you can. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're going out into the field to collect data on a particular population, do your due diligence in order to understand that population before you actually go out and collect data, so that you are prepared as a researcher for whatever may arise. Now, there may be other things that arise that you didn't anticipate. All of this research was done in various different agency contexts that all were very different. As you can see here, one of the data collection sites rather was DC Superior Court. It was very different dealing with a government entity as opposed to Center for Urban Families, which was a nonprofit organization. So dealing with a government entity such as a court system versus a nonprofit organization was totally different. Of course, there was much more bureaucracy in dealing with the court system as opposed to some of these other nonprofit organizations or nonprofit programs. And then you also see here, I had a local barbershop. That was a completely different site. And so I think that we just always have to do our best to prepare ourselves, but also be open to many things that arise in the field that are unexpected. And then also, now we're moving on to steps 5 and 6, which involve processing and analyzing data. And so we are now here in the social worker research process. And so I won't go too much into this either. We'll talk more about the analysis of data, as I mentioned before, in module 13. However, just as a reminder, my primary research question was what set of father characteristics, child characteristics, and contextual sources of stress and support best predict father involvement among non-resident African-American fathers. And so generally speaking, and this question was examined using SPSS, okay, which is, and SPSS stands for the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. So this is what SPSS stands for. And so at this particular time, when I did this research many years ago, online surveys were not as popular. I think maybe SurveyMonkey was probably the only option at that time. I don't even think Qualtrics was an option then. And so I manually entered all of my data into SPSS and crunched the numbers myself. And so what I found was out of all of the 6 factors there, or predictors rather, here on the left of the model, only 2 of them came back as significant predictors of father involvement. Specifically, parenting self-efficacy and parental relationship status were the most significant predictors of non-resident African-American father involvement. And so essentially what this means is that the more a father felt confident in his ability to be a good father and to handle any problems that arose with his children, the more likely he was to be involved in his children's lives. In addition, the status of the relationship between parents also was a significant predictor, in that particularly when a father reported having a relationship, having no relationship of any kind. So this particular status, when fathers reported that they did not have a relationship at all with their child's mother. So when they reported no relationship of any kind, this was also a significant predictor of a father's involvement in the lives of his children as well. And so both of these things really kind of brought me to even more questions, right? So quantitative research is limited in that it can tell us what, but it can't tell us why. So it can tell me what factors predict father involvement, but it can't tell me why these factors were so important. And so although I didn't share this with you here, I did conduct a small qualitative study to follow up on these things, to understand why these factors were such significant predictors of involvement. And I didn't share that here because it would have just been too much to share, but I did follow up on this with a qualitative portion to really delve more into the why behind these results. And then finally, step 7 is to write up and submit the report. Sometimes we may not necessarily submit it if this type of research is being done in an agency context. Sometimes we may not necessarily submit it to a particular entity at all. We might just write up the results and share it with others internally. We might share it with our supervisors. We might share it at a community meeting. It just depends. But we always want to get into the practice or habit of actually writing up our results, because the whole point in doing all of this is to share what we found with others. And so here we are at the last step in the process. And here's just a snippet of my write-up of my results. And so we'll talk more about this later on in the semester as well, but we won't get too much into this simply because we don't focus so much in this course on statistics and data analysis. But I just wanted to give you just a little brief synopsis of the write-up of my results. And so in summary, in this video lecture, we have covered the steps in the social work research process, which include identifying a problem and posing a research question, problem formulation, choosing a research design and data collection methods, implementing the research design and data collection methods, processing and analyzing data, and writing up the report or writing up our results. And as I mentioned, we will continue to talk through each of these steps as we go in the course of this semester. So the goal is not to understand each of these steps in depth right now. We will talk about each of them one by one, as I pointed out to you early on in this video lecture. Right now, the purpose of this lecture is just to give you an overview of each of the steps and just to foreshadow what is to come. So we'll definitely delve into each of these steps in greater detail as we progress forward together this semester. Now is the point at which I invite you to check for your understanding of each of these concepts discussed in this video. You can do this in one of 3 ways. You can do this by simply completing the form on the left and clicking submit, or copying and pasting the link to the right in your browser, or scanning the QR code with your cell phone. I hope that this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.